On the 2nd of September, 1898, on a dusty plain outside Khartoum, 50,000 men walked toward the British line. They came under their banners in the morning light, singing. They were not cowards. Many of them were among the bravest soldiers the world had ever produced. And bravery for 3,000 years had been enough. For 3,000 years, war had rewarded two things above all others: numbers and courage. The side with more men and more nerve usually won. Within a few hours, roughly 10,000 of those 50,000 men were dead. On the other side of that plain, the number of dead was 47. Not 4,700. 47. The British were not braver. They were not more numerous. They were fewer. What stood between the two armies was not a better soldier. It was a machine. A machine that did not tire, did not flinch, did not aim in any human sense, and did not stop. A gun that reloaded itself from the force of its own fire and could empty a belt of 250 rounds in under 30 seconds, again and again and again. That morning, on that plain, something ended that had defined human warfare since the first spear was thrown. The brave man, running at the enemy, had been the engine of every battle in history, and in the space of a single morning, he was made obsolete. This is the story of the machine that did it. Not a faster gun. A gun that removed the human being from the act of killing. And once that was possible, everything men had believed about war for 3,000 years, that courage decides, that numbers decide, that the charge can be won, became a lie. This is the story of the Maxim gun. To understand what the Maxim broke, you have to understand the world it walked into. For all of recorded history, killing at scale had one hard limit. A human arm, a man with a bow, could loose maybe a dozen arrows a minute, and then his shoulder failed. A man with a musket could fire 2 or 3 shots a minute if he was well drilled, if his hands were steady, if it wasn't raining. Even the finest soldier was a slow, tiring, frightened machine made of muscle and nerve. And so every army in history was built on the same simple arithmetic. To put more fire on the enemy, you needed more men. Firepower meant manpower. There was no other way, and so war had a shape, and the shape was the charge. You massed your men. You steadied their nerve with drill and discipline, and the man beside them, and you sent them forward to close with the enemy. Because if enough brave men reached the enemy line at once, the line broke. Courage, delivered in mass, was the decisive weapon. Every general from antiquity to the 19th century understood this in his bones. The whole art of war was the art of getting enough determined men across the last deadly stretch of ground, with their nerve intact. There had been warnings that the ground was shifting. In the American Civil War, in the 1860s, rifled muskets and breech-loaders had already made the old close-order charge horrifyingly costly. Men fell in windrows attacking prepared positions. But the lesson was written in blood and then ignored, because the limit still held. Even the fastest rifle was worked by a human hand, and a human hand tires. Armies told themselves that with enough men and enough courage, the charge would still carry. They were about to meet the machine that made that a fantasy. By the middle of the 19th century, inventors had begun to chip at the limit directly. In 1862, an American named Richard Gatling patented a gun with many barrels turned by a hand crank. A soldier turned the handle, the barrels rotated, and each one fired and reloaded in turn. The Gatling gun could throw out hundreds of rounds a minute, and for a moment it seemed like the future. But look closely at the Gatling, and you see the old world still trapped inside it. The barrels only turned because a man was turning them. Stop cranking, and the gun stops. It was faster than a rifle, but it was still powered by a human arm. The same arm, the same muscle, the same fatigue that had limited war since the beginning. The Gatling was a brilliant machine bolted onto a human engine, and the engine was still the problem. It was heavy, it needed a team to serve it, and its rate of fire rose and fell with how fast and how long a frightened man could crank a handle under fire. The man who would remove the engine was not a soldier. He was an inventor, and he was chasing money. Hiram Stevens Maxim was born in Sangerville, Maine, in February of 1840, the son of a farmer and mechanic. He was a restless, brilliant tinkerer who worked on everything: electric lighting, mousetraps, flying machines, hair-curling irons. He held hundreds of patents across his life. In 1881, he moved to Europe, and in 1882 in Vienna. He met an American acquaintance who gave him the piece of advice that would change the century. "Hang your chemistry and electricity," the man told him. "If you want to make a pile of money, invent something that will enable these Europeans to cut each other's throats with greater facility." Maxim listened. He turned his mind to the one problem no one had solved. Every rapid-fire gun still needed a man to power it, to crank, to load, to work the action. What if the gun could power itself? He had noticed, as a young man firing a rifle, how brutally it kicked his shoulder. Every time a gun fires, it kicks. That recoil is wasted energy, a violence thrown backward into the shooter. What if you could catch that violence and put it to work? What if the very thing that hurt the shooter could be made to load the next round? In 1884, in a small workshop at 57D Hatton Garden in London, Hiram Maxim built the answer. It was a single barrel, and the mechanism inside it was the whole revolution. When the gun fired, the recoil drove the barrel and the breech backward together for a short distance. As they went back, a jointed lever, a toggle, hinged like a human knee, buckled and broke, and that motion pulled the spent cartridge out of the chamber and flung it clear, while at the same time stripping a fresh round from a fabric belt. Then a spring drove everything forward again, chambering the new round, and the gun fired. And the recoil of that shot broke the toggle and did it all over again. The gun fed on its own fire. As long as you held the trigger and the belt fed, it would fire and reload and fire and reload. No man cranking, no man loading, nothing but a finger holding down a trigger. This was the thing that had never existed before. Not a faster gun, a gun that ran itself. The human arm, the limit on killing since the dawn of war, had been cut out of the loop entirely. The soldier was no longer the engine. He was just the switch. The numbers were almost unbelievable to the men who first saw it. The Maxim fired at a cyclic rate of roughly 500 to 600 rounds a minute. One gun, one crew of 4 men, could put out the fire of dozens of 100 trained riflemen. And unlike 100 riflemen, it never got tired, never got scared, and never needed to be talked into staying in its position. It was fed by belts of 250 rounds. And because a barrel firing that fast would quickly glow, warp, and melt, Maxim wrapped it in a jacket holding about a gallon of water. Under sustained fire, the water boiled. The steam could be run off through a hose, condensed, and poured back in. The gun could drink and keep shooting. He is said to have run over 200,000 rounds through his prototypes, proving it would not jam. Think about what that meant as arithmetic. For all of history, firepower had equaled manpower. To double your fire, you doubled your men, and men must be recruited, fed, paid, trained, housed, and kept from running away. Maxim had broken that equation. Now a handful of men and one machine could hold a stretch of ground that would have taken a battalion. The cost of killing, measured in human beings on your own side, collapsed. That is the real reason. The generals could not ignore it. And the real reason? It would remake the map of the world. The powerful came to Hatton Garden to watch. The Duke of Cambridge, the Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII, Lord Wolseley, Britain's most celebrated general. They stood in a London workshop and watched a machine fire itself, and they understood, some of them, that the ground had just shifted, under the entire art of war. Maxim knew what he had. He founded the Maxim Gun Company in 1884, backed by the industrialist Albert Vickers. Within a few years, the company merged into Maxim Nordenfelt, and then, in 1897, into Vickers itself, the great British arms firm whose name the gun would eventually carry. Maxim became a British subject, and in 1901 he was knighted, an honor first granted under Queen Victoria and conferred after her death by the new king. The tinkerer from Maine had become Sir Hiram Maxim, and he had done it exactly as the man in Vienna advised, by helping Europeans cut each other's throats. But a demonstration in a workshop proves nothing to a general. Armies are slow and proud and suspicious of anything that makes the soldier look small. The British Army trialed the Maxim through the late 1880s, ordered its first large batch under Lord Wolseley in 1888, and formally took it into service around 1889. And then the gun went looking for a battlefield, and it found one in the last great expansion of the European empires, in Africa. The first place the Maxim gun spoke clearly was in southern Africa, in 1893, in the war against the Ndebele kingdom, in what would become Rhodesia. At the Battle of the Shangani, in October, and again at Bembezi, in November, columns of the British South Africa Company, around 700 men, with just 5 Maxim guns drawn up behind their wagons, were attacked by thousands of Ndebele warriors. The warriors were brave, and they came on in the old way, in mass, on foot, with courage, exactly as warriors had done for all of history. And the Maxims killed them in numbers that are hard to read even now, something like 1,500 at the Shangani, and perhaps 2,500 at Bembezi, for a handful of company dead. Here, not in the famous battle to come, but here, in these small colonial fights, is the cleanest picture of what the Maxim did. A few hundred men, holding a fixed line with 5 self-loading guns, annihilated an army many times their size. The courage of the attackers was total, and the courage was worth nothing. The gun did not care how brave they were. It only counted how fast they came, and it could always count faster than they could run. For the first time in history, a battle could be decided not by which side had more brave men, but simply by which side had the machine. And then, in 1898, came the battle that told the whole world. Kitchener's Anglo-Egyptian army marched south up the Nile to break the modest state that had held Sudan since it destroyed a British force at Khartoum 13 years before. Kitchener brought the industrial age with him. Around 25,000 men, 44 Maxim guns, 20 on land, and 24 more mounted on gunboats that steamed up the river alongside the army, floating batteries that could not be outflanked, and more than 50 modern quick-firing artillery pieces. Against him, at dawn on the 2nd of September, on the plain of Kereri, outside Omdurman, came the army of the Khalifa, some 50,000 men, advancing under a forest of banners. Among the British was a young cavalry lieutenant and war correspondent named Winston Churchill, who watched their war cry rise, in his words, like the surf on a rocky shore. Now here we have to be careful, because this is the battle that gets told wrong. It is tempting to say the Maxims mowed them down. They did not do it alone, and the truth is, in some ways, worse. Long before the modest army was even in range of the Maxims, Kitchener's artillery and the massed rifles of his infantry opened fire at ranges of over 2,000 meters and began to destroy an army that was still walking forward across open ground. The gunboats on the Nile added their fire from the flank. The Maxims joined a killing that had already begun. It was not one weapon. It was the whole machinery of industrial war, working together on men armed largely with spears and swords and older rifles and unbreakable courage. They never had a chance to reach the line. They were being killed the entire time they were trying to close the distance, and the distance could not be closed. And then, at Omdurman, in the middle of the battle that proved the charge was dead, The British made one of the last great cavalry charges in their history. Churchill's own regiment, the 21st Lancers, about 400 horsemen, charged a body of modest fighters and rode straight into a hidden mass of them, packed in a dry watercourse. It became a savage few minutes of hand-to-hand killing. The regiment took heavy casualties and won 3 Victoria Crosses. Churchill fired his pistol into the crush and survived. It was gallant and it was glorious, and it was already an anachronism. The Lancers had ridden, sabers out, into the last age of war, at the exact battle where a machine on a tripod was making men like them obsolete forever. The result of the day was not a battle. The war correspondent G.W. Stevens, who was there, wrote the line that everyone remembers, and almost everyone gets wrong. It was not Churchill who said it. It was Stevens. It was not a battle, he wrote, but an execution. By mid-morning the ground was, in his words, all white with dead men's drapery. Somewhere between 10 and 12,000 of the Khalifa's men lay dead. Kitchener had lost 47, perhaps 48. Churchill, watching, wrote his own verdict. And it is the truer one. The terrible machinery of scientific war, he wrote, had done its work. The dervish host was scattered and destroyed, not beaten by better men, processed by better machines. The age had a poet, and the poet understood exactly what he was looking at. In 1898, the same year as Omdurman, Hilaire Belloc wrote a line that has been quoted ever since. Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun, and they have not. It is usually quoted as a boast. It was not. Belloc was mocking the men who thought a machine made them superior. The whole swaggering arrogance of empire condensed into 2 lines that damned it. The gun did not make the men who held it better. It only made the men in front of it dead. For a few years, an illusion held. The generals of Europe looked at Omdurman and at the African wars and drew the wrong lesson. They saw a weapon that slaughtered lightly armed tribesmen, and they told themselves it would be different between civilized armies, between brave white men who would press home the attack with proper spirit. The machine gun, they decided, was a weapon for colonial policing. It would never stop a determined European charge. They were about to be proven wrong in the most catastrophic way in human history. Because the Maxim did not stay British. Maxim licensed and sold his design across the world, and every great power built its own version. Germany adopted a near copy in 1908 and called it the Maschinengewehr 08, the MG-08. Britain refined the Maxim into a lighter, superb weapon called the Vickers gun, adopted in 1912. Both were water-cooled. Both fired at hundreds of rounds a minute. Both were, under the skin, the same gun, the machine born in that London workshop in 1884, now built in the thousands and pointed in every direction. In August 1914, the armies of Europe marched to war, still believing in the charge, in dash and spirit, in the courage of massed men crossing open ground to close with the enemy. They marched, in other words, into the exact situation the Ndebele had faced at Bembezi, and the Mahdists at Omdurman, except now both sides had the machine. The result was not victory for either side. It was stalemate. The machine gun is a defensive weapon of terrible efficiency, and to understand the First World War you have to understand why. A single gun does not just fire forward, it is placed to fire across the front of the position, in a long cone, sweeping sideways. Sight 2 of them, so their cones cross, and every inch of ground in front of the line is covered by fire from the side. Fire the attacker often cannot even see coming. A handful of guns dug in could put an impassable curtain of bullets across hundreds of yards of open ground, and since both sides had them, neither side could advance. The armies dug into the earth to escape the fire, and the trenches stretched from the Channel to the Alps, and for 4 years, men died by the million trying to cross a few hundred yards of ground that a few self-loading guns had made impossible to cross. The clearest single day of it came on the 1st of July 1916 on the Somme. After a week-long bombardment that was supposed to destroy everything in the German lines, The British infantry climbed out of their trenches and walked forward across open ground, heavily loaded in long ordered lines, exactly as the old art of war demanded. But the German gunners had waited out the shelling deep underground, in dugouts cut 10 meters into the chalk, and when the bombardment lifted, they climbed back up and set up their MG-08s, the licensed grandchild of Hiram Maxim's gun, and opened fire. Men were hit the instant they stepped into the open. By nightfall, the British Army had suffered 57,470 casualties. 19,240 of them were dead. It remains the bloodiest single day in the history of the British Army. It was not machine guns alone. It was machine guns and rifles, and above all artillery, together. The same combined machinery that had killed at Omdurman now turned on the men who had built it. But the machine gun was the heart of the deadlock. It was the weapon that made walking toward the enemy, the oldest act in war, into simple suicide. The charge was dead. The cavalry, which had ruled battlefields since before Rome, was finished. Courage had not been defeated. Courage had been made irrelevant. Hiram Maxim did not live to see the worst of it. He died in London on the 24th of November, 1916, in the very year of the Somme, the year his machine reaped its most terrible harvest. He had done exactly what the man in Vienna told him to do. He had invented something that enabled the Europeans to cut each other's throats with greater facility, and it had made him rich and knighted, and it had helped kill a generation. So think again about that plane outside Khartoum, and the 47 dead. It looks at first like a story about a powerful weapon. It is really a story about a line that was crossed and never uncrossed. For all of human history, killing had required a human being, a hand to draw the bow, an arm to swing the sword, a shoulder to absorb the recoil. The number of people you could kill was limited by the number of people you had, and by how tired their arms became, and by how afraid they were. War was horrible, but it was human-sized. It ran on muscle and nerve have limits. Hiram Maxim removed the human being from the machine. He built a device that fed on its own violence, that reloaded from the force of its own fire, that needed a person only to point it and hold down a trigger. And the moment that was possible, the ancient link between courage and victory, between numbers and power, was cut. A single frightened man behind a Maxim gun was worth more than 100 brave men in front of it. That line has never been uncrossed. Every weapon since, the tank, the bomber, the missile, the drone circling a village on the far side of the world, flown by someone who will go home for dinner, is a child of the idea born in that London workshop. The idea that the human being is the weak point in war, and that the machine should do the killing. The soldiers who walked toward the British line at Omdurman were not defeated by braver men. They were defeated by a machine that made their bravery meaningless. And that, more than any single battle, is the moment the modern world began. Not the day a weapon got faster. The day the machine took the killing out of human hands and never gave it back.